Hello and welcome to this Division of Perceptual Studies webinar exploring the fascinating topic of after-death communications. My name is Melanie Smith and I am part of the communications team at the division, also known as DOPS, which was founded in 1967 by Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. DOPS is the most productive and longest running university-based research group devoted to the rigorous evaluation of empirical evidence for extraordinary human experiences and capacities. Our work extends beyond scientific investigation to include exploration of the ongoing impact of this research on people today and implications for scientific theory. You can learn more about our mission and efforts on our website, www.uvadops.org. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from one of our senior researchers here at DOPS, Dr. Kim Penberthy. Dr. Penberthy, PhD, ABPP, is the Chester F. Carlson Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences in the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. She also has a faculty appointment at the UVA Cancer Center. She is the immediate past president of the Society of Clinical Psychology and a fellow of humanism in medicine at the University of Virginia. Dr. Penberthy has published extensively on multiple areas of psychology, mindfulness, and the human experience, and lectures internationally regarding her research. She studies the mind-body relationship, exploring human consciousness as well as extraordinary human experiences, including the impact of such on human abilities and wellness. Her research includes addressing fear of death and dying, as well as grief and grieving, and exploring the impact of perceived after-death communications, among other experiences. She is involved on an international level, conducting research and consulting with the Center for Consciousness Research and the Scientific and Medical Network. Kim is also dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion and exploring and honoring psychotherapeutic and contemplative practices from Indigenous and Native cultures. Her most recent book is co-authored with her daughter Morgan and is entitled Living Mindfully Across the Lifespan, an Intergenerational Guide, published by Routledge, Taylor, and Francis. We are delighted to have Kim with us here tonight to share her extensive knowledge of the scientific study of after-death communication. During the webinar, you can use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to submit questions for Kim, who will speak for about 40 minutes and then answer as many questions as possible before we wrap up at 9 p.m. Eastern. Note that the Q&A function is not the same as the chat. You'll want to use Q&A and not chat to submit questions through the webinar. And now, without further ado, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Kim Penberthy.
Thank you so much. I am very, very happy to be here this evening. And yes, we are going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about after-death communication, the history, research, and impact. A little bit of what was already covered. I'd just like to highlight that this work is done at the University of Virginia in our Division of Perceptual Studies, of which I'm a part. This division has been around over 50 years, and our core mission is really to evaluate whether mind and brain are distinct and separable, and whether consciousness survives physical death. As a clinician, I'm also very interested in whether or not these experiences impact people in general, their symptoms, their experiences of life, of relationships, and how these experiences can ultimately impact our communities. I think it is important to state that we are not the first, and hopefully will not be the last, to explore these kind of experiences. Many people and cultures before us have pursued this knowledge, both this knowledge of consciousness and specifically this knowledge of communication with ancestors that have passed on. Many cultures around the world for a millennial have experienced this and interacted with their deceased generations. So some of the work we do might seem new to us in the Western world, and yet it has been around for a long time. I like to explain briefly how I got interested in this. My early interest, even as a young child, were influenced by Raymond Moody and his work, as well as Emanuel Swedenborg, who influenced me a great deal with his theology and his spiritualism, as well as the writings of people like Kurt Vonnegut and different writings that I studied on yoga and meditation. So early on, I was very fascinated by this and wanting to know how I could make this part of my life in a bigger way. I was fascinated by Raymond Moody, the psychomantiums that he discussed, and some early experiences that I had myself. This led me to also I must say, explore some other history of the place I grew up. So I grew up in Lewisburg, West Virginia, which is in Greenbrier County. And as a young person, we all knew this story that I'd like to share with you, which I now see was an early story of an after-death communication. This was a story about a woman named Zona, a young woman who was newly married and quickly found dead at the bottom of a staircase in her home soon after her marriage. She was deceased, and they declared it a natural cause, and that was that. However, Zona appeared in an after-death communication to her mother and told how her new husband had actually broken her neck. So this led to an investigation. The body was exhumed and found to have a broken neck that had been hidden by a ribbon tied around her neck. And believe it or not, the mother was allowed to testify about this communication. And that evidence, that testimony, actually helped to put the husband away for murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. This is all historical fact. You can find it. It is the only documented instance of U.S. history where an after-death communication was used to help convict a murderer. I grew up with this story, very well known to me. So I think these aspects helped influence my decision to then go into psychology and study mainstream psychology. Certainly, I also studied mindfulness, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, meditation, and alternative components of therapy, including transpersonal, in addition to my mainstream cognitive behavioral therapy. And I feel that this has really well equipped me to work in this field, both as a researcher and a clinician. My interest in after-death communication was only heightened by working with patients in the cancer center. I work and continue to work with patients who are very ill, are facing their own death, and their family members who are also on this journey with them. And through that work, I became aware of just how impactful and important after-death communications were to the people that were left behind. And I want to describe what exactly I mean when I'm speaking about an after-death communication. So this is specifically a communication that is spontaneous. So this is what we've studied, not ones that are mediated by another entity like a Ouija board or a psychic, but really spontaneous communications that are apparently initiated by the deceased person to the person experiencing it. It's direct, so no intervention of other people, no use of devices. And typically, this message is conveyed. A message is conveyed. So it is giving some information. It's communicating something, thus the name communication. So often No matter what the form, it is reassuring. It might resolve some emotional or cognitive complexities. It's reaffirming and often allows a release. This ADC occurs when what we're calling the person experiences a contact unexpectedly and perceives that deceased person in a manner that is interpreted as indicative of a continued survival of some aspect of that person. So this is it is an emotional communication. It is a cognitive communication. It's an identity, an awareness of an identity. That's what we're talking about. This has been studied enough to be able to qualify different typologies. So we typically think of about 12 main categories. You might think of more. Sensing a presence is one of the most common types. So that's that physical sensation that someone is near, you know, like their energy, that feeling of their presence. Hearing a voice, so literally hearing them speak to you as if they were in the room. Feeling a touch. I've worked with people who feel the touch of a hand, brushing against them, or someone patting them, or something even more intimate. Smelling of fragrance, so aware of this aroma out of nowhere that is affiliated with that deceased individual. Visual experiences, so this can range from more ephemeral appearances or more solid forms. Often, if you have them while you're in bed, they may be at the foot of the bed. And these visions are typically seen, we'll talk more about this, but often seen as you are falling asleep or maybe waking in the morning. Visions, sometimes they're even very much lifelike and real. Twilight experiences I discussed can be when you're waking from sleep, or other sort of states of consciousness, such as praying or meditating. While you're asleep, you can have after-death communications. The one we talked about from Zona was in that state. You can have out-of-body contact with the deceased. That is described as a visitation. This might happen while you're meditating or doing some other sort of activity that sends you into an out-of-body state. A physical phenomena, this might be lights going off and on. We've heard of appliances turning on, radios turning on. Now, with our modern technology, we also hear about things like instrumental transcommunication, so through phones, voicemails, even text messages and emails. And of course, very commonly symbolic after-death communications. These are signs that your loved one is with you. So this may be something that you discussed before the person passed away, something that represents them, a bird, a butterfly that you see. And often in this case, the communication is not just the object, the symbolism of it, it's the timing, when it happens, as if that is part of the communication, the presence of the object and the timing. So you might say, well, these are fascinating. And yes, we've seen that they've occurred throughout history as long as man has recorded. How common do we see them now? Well, it's very interesting because the Pew Research Center did a poll quite recently, April of 2023, and they asked Americans, now this was only Americans specifically, about their experiences with after-death communications. They called them interacting with dead relatives. So what we found in that really recent research was that for Americans, if you look at the second bullet point down, 53% of them said they had had an after-death communication in their lifetime. So these are Americans in 2023. That is, to me, a very high number. I was quite surprised by that. If you look at the literature, that first bullet point, the estimates are a little bit more broad. So estimates between 25% and 60% of people worldwide report experiencing one or more spontaneous after-death communications. So that's sort of broad. The middle mark there might be around this 53%. But to see that in today's age, that was really impressive to me. 44% said that they'd had an experience like this in the past year. So even more impressive. What this might lead you to think, which is one of the things I immediately thought of, is these appear to be fairly common. And maybe they are natural experiences that are meant to happen to humans. Maybe we are wired this way because our consciousness does leave and return in ways that we can detect. So some colleagues and I, several years ago, decided to try to get together and put together a survey. So assess people across different countries to see what these experiences are like in modern times. So really just trying to describe some of the phenomenology, just finding out what is out there, what is happening with people, what are they experiencing. So this was a survey that we ended up getting some funding for and provided it in English, French, and Spanish. And really, we were literally looking to describe this phenomena. So who has them? What are the circumstances? These sorts of questions. Importantly, we also wanted to describe the impact on people who had them. So not just are they out there, are people having them, what are they like? We wanted to see how do people make sense of this? What is the impact? And how does it influence specifically the grieving process? Are there any other components that we need to know about? So this survey was put together. It was quite comprehensive. It was provided in a safe manner online. Some of my listeners might have even participated in this. So there were opportunities to answer a lot of questions, 194 questions, with some description of the actual communication that you had as well. So there were sort of questions you answered, and then there were also sort of open format questions where you could describe in more depth. So we call those closed and open questions. And of course, you were able to omit anything that wasn't applicable or you didn't feel comfortable answering. So over a period of time, we were able to get nearly 1,000 respondents to this, which is quite impressive because this was a commitment to fill out one of these surveys for sure. So this is just some overall demographic data that we got for the whole study. And you can see the breakdown, pretty much, equal French and English language versions, so 41 and 43% there, and some Spanish speaking people also completed it, not quite as many. Overall, the preponderance of the people reporting were female, which to me is interesting and sort of fits with the demographics of the research so far. A little bit more about this larger population. Most of them were in some sort of stable relationship, so with a partner or married or a registered partnership. Many of them were quite well educated, so about half had a university or college equivalent. So this is sort of helping us understand who these people were. And what we found from that larger study, this was published in 2021, was that indeed, these people did experience these after-death communications as very important or even life-changing. And only 12% reported that their experience was frightening. That is important to keep in mind, because that's still not an insignificant number of participants who found it to be frightening. This is comparable with previous research, and it's hard to tell because we didn't follow up and ask this. We don't know what aspect was frightening about it. And indeed, it could have been the fact that they didn't understand what was happening. So we also found in this larger study that belief in life after death and this idea that deceased can communicate with the living also significantly increased after their reported after-death communication. I would think this is not a surprise because the experience of it was so real for many of them. They recorded that it was powerful enough to shift their beliefs. Also, we found, importantly, that experiencing an after-death communication had significant impact on reducing the fear of death in the people that had experienced them. This is what they reported. They also reported an increase in spiritual beliefs. So the way we measured this, because we did just assess this at one time point, so they answered questions about themselves prior to having the after-death communication as best they could recollect. And then the same questions they were asked to rate after they had the after-death communication. So it does have this flaw that it's not prospective. It's quite challenging to do a prospective study on after-death communications, as you can imagine. What we found was there was this reduction in fear of death. There is this increase in belief in life after death. And there is an increase in spiritual beliefs. Now, religiosity, as endorsed by the participants, did not change. So that means if they were religious before, if they endorsed high religiosity, that was maintained. If they endorsed low religiosity and had an after-death communication, that was maintained. So it was really the spiritual beliefs that seemed to change. So this was obviously a primary objective of our larger study. We also, though, wanted to focus additionally on the effect of this after-death communication on beliefs in spirituality and religion because of the things we just talked about. So you can see here very significant changes in spirituality, beliefs about life after death, and beliefs that the deceased can contact living persons. So these people are believing their experiences and trusting them. We were very interested in a particular subgroup of this population who were people that received after-death communication from deceased partners or spouses. So these were their partners, their loved ones that they had spent time with as a partner or a spouse. And we wanted to see who are having these experiences and what their relationship was like prior to death. So to describe it a little bit more, who has an after-death communication from their partner or spouse? And what kind of impact does that have on grief, sadness? And we looked to some of the prior research because we know from the research that the after-death communications are more likely to be found in people who lost a partner or spouse. So some of the older literature calls them widows and widowers. And there was a summary of some of these findings that was done in 2011 by Street Horn. And you can see our summary table here that she collected. So you see different years, they're in chronological order. These are smaller sample sizes than we have for sure. And you see, though, the prevalence rates are fairly high. So these are only in widows and widowers who of those widows and widowers sort of report these prevalence rates. So you see a low of 42 in 2023 in Denmark and a high of 80% there in England in 1964. But if you average this, you know, it's in line with about 50% or so. So we looked at our participants and pulled out those after-death communications that were from a partner or spouse. And you can see the frequency was about 41% in that age range of the 60s, 69. So that's primarily who had them, those folks in that age range. They were predominantly female, and that's equivalent to our sample. Our sample is predominantly female. And they were still widowed. So most of them had not remarried. or were not living with partners. They were mostly still widowed. And when we ask about their relationship with their partner who was deceased, overwhelmingly, they endorsed that it was an extremely close and loving relationship emotionally, and that there was no unresolved conflict. That was a little less significant. That's 68%, almost 67%. But when we're thinking about, well, what does this mean? This means that most of the people receiving these after-death communications were females in their 60s who had a close, loving relationship and no unresolved conflict with their male partner or their partner. And the impact of this after-death communication on their grief, they did not endorse that it made it more painful. Some people ask me, well, doesn't it make it more painful if I am having communications? Again, that's a very personal thing. However, what we found in this study is it did not. About 61% said it did not make it more painful. About 30% said it did. For their bereavement and the importance of this in their process of bereavement, it was pretty overwhelming. 81% said, yes, this was very important. They said that their path might have been different without this, their bereavement path, and that their ADC brought comfort, 81%. Did it make it easier to accept the loss? Not really. And to me, this makes sense that it's still painful that this person is not here in a physical form, and yet there is some connection and comfort from having the ADC. So it is a very complicated experience for most people. Feelings about the after-death communication and the impact on grief, some additional questions that we asked, their feelings about this experience, they pretty much overwhelmingly treasure it. So 84% treasure it. They're, very glad they had it. Most were not frightened, as we talked about, but some were. It did influence their grieving to some degree, but not extensively. So this again was mixed because it's complicated. And so these experiences might have had very powerful emotional impacts and cognitive impacts. And the grieving process may have been influenced for the better or not. So some folks were even not sure. Did it accelerate recovery? Again, not real clear cut. So very complicated, and we need to explore this more, but I really believe this is part of the nature of the complexity of human relationships. A wish for more contact, yes, they do wish for more contact. So that was also very interesting. So the impact of this experience on their grief-related sadness was that it did seem to impact it. So we see that many of them had very extreme deep mourning prior to, about half of them, and afterwards they endorse that their grief is reduced, about 40% of them, and some of them said it stays the same. Again, very complicated. It may have impacts, and yet you may still be experiencing some sadness and missing the individual. That to me is not incompatible. So in summary, for this pretty extensive study, we saw that many of these people, 81%, report that this after-death communication brought them comfort or healing. And this signifies to me as a clinical psychologist and a therapist that this has a potential therapeutic nature. So these experiences might not only be natural for us, they might be healing. Many of these people did consider this to be important in their bereavement process. And I wonder, I wish I could go back and ask them, did it seem more helpful if they had someone to work through this with them? I think that may be an important component. Many of these people reported their relationship deepened even further after this experience. So imagine that. this understanding that the relationship is going on and it is continuing and it is deepening. It did not seem to make the physical absence more painful, although for about 40% it did. And many of them expressed a wish for more contact. Again, these conflicting, sort of complicated findings that some people report sadness remaining the same and some report a reduction. And some found that this helped their sadness, and some found that their sadness was removed entirely. But that was a smaller percentage. Most of them, though, did endorse that their spirituality level increased after this after-death communication. They experienced this as authentic. And I can ascertain this, I can testify to this both from the research study we did and individuals that I've worked with myself. We see a decrease in fear of death in people who've had these experiences, an increase in spirituality. It typically does bring comfort and healing and an increased belief in life after death, as I said. And these experiences are typically very, very treasured. I mean, these can really impact the direction of your life, change the mourning or bereavement process very significantly. Why is this important? Obviously, it's important to the individual who is experiencing this. There's no doubt. To me, as a clinician, as a community member, as a healer, it is also important because globally, we know that COVID, wars, unrest have created a mortality shock that is throughout the world. And it really is a shock. And it may have, we hypothesize based on the literature and the research we've done, it may have created the second wave of population health concerns. We know it has, and that's bereavement. The burden of bereavement for COVID deaths will be higher than the death toll by nearly an order of magnitude. So each death, this was estimated right after COVID, each death from COVID left roughly 9 times as many people bereaved. So the impact then is significant on people that are at increased risk for suffering from prolonged grief disorder. And if you're not familiar with what this is moving beyond your grief and bereavement into unable to sort of move past it, and it reaches almost pathological state. It is pathological. It's a newly identified diagnosis in what we call the DSM-5, our Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Psychiatry, and it is experiencing grief symptoms to a significant degree for 12 months or longer. And so obviously, this is a huge burden with the increasing death rates and mortality shocks to the world, creating this wave of bereavement and increasing rates of prolonged grief disorder due to the same. So this is part of why it's important that we look to these experiences as also not just interesting experiences that we study to explore consciousness and whether our consciousness or soul or spirit persists beyond the death of our body. This is important to look at what does this mean for the survivors, for people left behind, for the communities, and can we use this in a way to help heal? Can we invite an after-death communication? So far, what we've been talking about has really been focused on spontaneous after-death communications that people report. We know, due to some pioneering work from colleagues, that we can also invite this. So a typical strategy of what's called an induced after-death communication is to be open, to accept that, that we need to be open to the experience and often put expectations aside. So this means not focusing too hard, but accepting that it's normal to feel nervous. You may feel a little silly or a little anxious, and then just notice what arises if you invite this, if you sort of are open to it. Try not to judge yourself, not edit or analyze, and be prepared. Be prepared that you may experience something if you are open to it, and that you might not. So these can be induced, as I said, through specific techniques with induced after-death communication, and there are books written about that. There are meditation-induced experiences that you can promote. And some of these is, if you remember the psychomantium of Raymond Moody, you can sort of do yourself through the meditations, maybe looking at a mirror in the dark, or looking at a bowl of water, a pool, and being open to it. So being receptive. I've worked with individuals who did this process, and it came through in different ways. Some began writing. They felt the urge to write, and they wrote. And so the communication came through that. Some had different experiences of sensations, physical sensations, or words or images. So, and some didn't have anything. And we worked with that and how that felt, and how they can move forward, and how they might make sense of that. So I invite you not only to think about this as perhaps part of being human. Maybe we are built this way, and to receive these if we need them, and that maybe we can study them further as a way of thinking about healing and dealing with grief. We are currently exploring more research and looking at something we're calling a veridical after-death communication, or you might think of it as verifiable. And so you can see here, we are interested in your experiences. In this study particularly, we are going to be looking for people who've had after-death communications that they believe can be validated or verified. And so these would be experiences you had perhaps with someone. Maybe you had a visual experience and someone was with you and witnessed it as well. Maybe you received information from this communication that you could not have received in any other way, and we can validate that. So if you or anyone you know has had experiences like this, we are very interested. We're collecting these. We are hoping to sort of explore what these look like in real life in modern times. So if you have a smartphone with you, you're welcome to take a picture of this QR code here, the little square grid, and that will take you to our initial survey that will route you to us. So if you want to do that, we'd be very, very happy. And we hope to continue our work in this arena. We have research also that's coming up looking at prolonged grief disorder specifically, and another questionnaire for that is on our website that is looking at different treatment options for prolonged grief disorder, asking the population and healthcare providers what they think about the treatment options that are out there currently. So that is not on this QR code. It is on the QR codes on our DOPS website, which I'd be happy for you to visit in order to learn more about this ongoing research. So with that, it's 8:40, and I want to say thank you. These are some of the amazing, amazing people who worked with me and made this all happen. I won't say all their names, it's very long. And the Be All Foundation obviously to help with the funding, we are very appreciative. And of course, University of Virginia and the Division of Perceptual Studies. So thank you for your time and attention tonight. I look forward to answering your questions.
Great. We have so many questions to get through. We won't be able to get to all of them. I'm going to go through here, and I might combine some of them that are similar. And we have marked some of these answered, so you can actually see, if you're a participant, you can see where people have shared some stories, and we always love that. Okay. First of all, there's been a couple people asking, or a few people asking about the prevalence of women responding to the study. Do you think that is because women have after-death communications more often than men, or is it more that women may be more likely to respond to a survey? How do you account for that big jump from men to women?
I think it is probably both. So I think it's probably multiple factors. For some of the older age populations, you may have just more women than men in general. So that's one thing. I think that women may report this more frequently. And I also do wonder if women may be perhaps more socially socialized to accept these, to experience these, and to report them. So I think it's perhaps, you know, a combination of those things. I do think it's very interesting, though, because I would love to try to find a way to, you know, access more people who identify as male, because I think that I think it's important to find out, are there differences there? And right now with our study, even as large as it is, it's a much smaller portion who are identifying as male, and that makes it difficult to really say anything super, you know, super definitive about them.
Thank you. Okay, do you have a favorite after-death communication story that you've heard or experience that you just love to share with people that just really struck you?
Well, I can share, and I have permission. This is someone I worked with not that long ago, and to me, it's so touching because I think it's often what we might see in some the death of a partner or spouse. So this person had their spouse die, and the relationship had been, it was a long marriage. They had children, they had careers. It was like many of us, you know, it had its ups and downs. And when the wife died, the husband was really experiencing prolonged grief. So had this ongoing for quite a while. And finally, we were working together. Finally, he said, I know I loved her. I know I loved her. I just don't know if she loved me. I don't know if I did enough, if I was good enough. And I think often I hear this, that people have these doubts that was it okay? Did I do okay? And no matter what I said, it wasn't going to prove anything to him. I could say, yes, when we talked, she loved you, she said good things. It's not enough. And so eventually he came to me, he kept hanging in there with me. We kept seeing each other. And he said one day, he said, it's happened. She came to me. And I said, what? Are you serious? He said, yes. He said, I'm not going to tell you much more because it was very intimate. And I know she loves me now. And that's all I needed to hear. And so from that point on, we saw this improvement. I don't have to, I'm not working with him anymore. It's, you know, it was that reassurance, that communication, a very intimate communication and expression that helped. So I've not been in touch. I don't know if they've been ongoing. Sometimes they are. It opens something up and there's more received. Sometimes it's one time. And so that's one that's quite recent and very powerful to me.
Thank you. Great. I want to talk a little bit about the roughly 12% of people who find ADCs distressing. And I know in your presentation you mentioned that maybe it was distressing because in the moment, because it was spontaneous. It was just scary. They weren't expecting it. Some of the questions that have come through have been, can we dig into that a little? Were they initially scared and then comforted later? Did you find a way to measure that or capture that? Is there anything that you could take from those 12% that maybe it eventually was comforting, or anything that you were able to glean from that in your research that was significant?
I think these are amazing questions. And unfortunately, we do not have all the answers to that. This is a study that we have on our list that we want to look at. So I'm glad people are interested. We have some hypotheses, and I can speak about hypotheses. We want some data, though. We really want some data from these people. As you can imagine, it's not always easy to get that information, because we were actually quite surprised that we got 12% who endorsed this, because often people who had a scary or unpleasant or terrifying experience are not going to answer these questions. So I think we need to be creative in thinking of ways that we can access people, get this information from them, and then find out exactly those questions. Those are really, really good questions, because we don't know. Was this because it was in conflict with their belief system or their religion, or that it was actually scary because they didn't expect it, or because it was maybe unsettling, or they got bad news. So we need more research in that area, and that is one of the studies we have on the slate to look at. So thank you so much. I'm glad a lot of us are on the same wavelength with that.
Great. Yeah, another thing that's come up in the questions, I want to kind of generalize and group them, is about how we are handling these experiences as empirical evidence. How approaching them with scientific rigor, and in that same vein, how do we respond to criticism of the work? How do you do? What is the criticism you get? How do you manage that? What does all that look like, just from a scientific lens, and then the time that we're in and the community that we're in?
Absolutely. So I like to think of it in two aspects, because I am a clinician and a researcher. So as a researcher, it's absolutely important to me to think about this, to think about what is the data we're collecting, how can we make it as accurate as possible. And it's very clear to me, these are self-reports. These are people stating what they experienced. So there's just the caveat that this is self-report. So people could make it up. That is part of why we want to look at these verifiable after-death communications. So we want to take it to the next level, dig a little deeper and say, okay, can we find the people that have these experiences and can prove it, so to speak? Because that does take it to another level. Secondly, as a clinician, I have to say, if it has an impact, if it helps with grief and grieving, if it improves the quality of your life, I am less interested in whether or not it is quote unquote real, because it is real to that person and it has a real impact on their symptoms. And I have seen that. So I really work in both of these worlds, and I don't think they're incompatible. I think if this is not hurting anyone, and if it is something that a person experiences as positive, improving their symptoms, improving their quality of life, then that's what I'm going to go with. And we're going to explore that. We're going to unpack it. I do want to say one caveat. I think some of the frightening components, or the sort of the mixed data that we saw, where some people it improved their grief and some people it didn't, or their sadness, it may be due to how it was handled. Did someone have anyone to share this with? Were they able to talk about it with maybe a religious leader or a friend or a family member? And were they believed? And did they sort of have some way of accommodating this in their worldview? Because I do think that makes a difference for many people. And I've seen this, an experience like this is awe-inspiring. I mean, it is one of the biggest events of their life, and it needs to be processed. You need to talk about it. You need to have wrestle with it, have a deeper understanding, or revel in it, and let it soak in. And I think, unfortunately, in our culture, people are sort of reticent to share because maybe they think someone's going to not believe them or think they're crazy. Over and over again, I've talked to people who didn't share with their doctor, or even their counselor, or even their minister or rabbi, because they were afraid. And I think if we can make this something that is talked about, and we pull it out, and we say, yes, look, this is happening to half our population. And those are just the people that will endorse it. And maybe it's happening to more people who weren't in the polls or in the research. I really feel like we have an obligation to bring it out and look at it and talk about it, because my hunch is that this is how we're built, and that maybe this is, that we're really onto something here.
Great, thank you. There's been some questions about cultural differences, religious differences, and in the acceptance of these experiences, the rate of reporting, the impact. Were you able? I know there was a lot of data, United States, France. What can you glean from the data about how different cultures and different religions handle this information and the impact?
So yes, there was so much more data that I didn't put in here because it's sort of overwhelming. What we saw, we did ask them their religious status. So if they, identified it with a particular religion, and we saw that there were people from all kinds of backgrounds. So, all the major religions and minor religions, and atheism and agnostic. So in the survey, the larger survey, all of these sorts of people were endorsing these. So it didn't seem to really only happen to, certain people, or people who endorsed a certain religious belief system. So we did not have the opportunity to sort of go in and dissect a lot of that and look at, what are the differences. We're in the process now of looking at some more of these subgroups. The religious was not one of the subgroups we're looking at right now. We're looking at specifically individuals who died more suddenly. So unexpectedly, like violent murders and things like that, and the after-death communications from those individuals is one subgroup that we're looking at because we had some hypotheses. We have not been specifically looking at religious status, primarily because the numbers get smaller and smaller, and so it's harder to find significance with subgroups that are quite small.
It's interesting that you brought up the unexpected or more violent deaths and the rate of ADCs reported. I know you're still working through that and that's something coming up, but what are some of your hunches, if you don't mind sharing? Where's the data trending? What do you expect to see?
Right. So we thought that perhaps these sudden deaths may be different in significant ways, such as maybe they're conveying a message more often, sort of like Zona, what we saw with my story that I grew up with. I know my hunch was like, oh yes, then they're going to come and they could give information. So we didn't find that interestingly, but yeah, we didn't find as many differences as we thought we might between that. So, but we continue to look, and we will be writing a manuscript on that. So, very interesting indeed.
I want to talk about the several people know that we have a neuroimaging lab. We have an fMRI machine in our lab. Have we been able to study brain patterns, brain activity during an ADC because we've been able to study more induced? I know most of tonight was about spontaneous, but what about induced? How do we study that? Have we studied that? And then what does that look like, and what can you speak to on that?
Sure. Yes, our new lab director, David Acunzo, and I have spoken about this. And as you can hear from tonight, even, we have a lot of projects in mind. We have spoken about this idea with the imaging of being able to induce these there's a couple of different methods that we could use. And so that would involve bringing, people in who agree to do these studies and looking at the brain waves while we're inducing this. You can do it that way. You can also presumably look at, before and after these experiences. So we've got that again on our list of to-dos, and we'll hope to be able to get to that. The complicating factor there, obviously, is that if you're inducing it, you're often using a methodology. And so, clinicians and researchers will understand this. So if I'm using mindfulness-induced ADC or the EMDR that is used, that's the eye movement desensitization that is used in induced ADC, then we are looking at the brain potentially involved in that. So you would need to make sure that you can, image the brain throughout that and the experience then of the after-death communication. So it's tricky, very tricky.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. We have run out of time. I want to do a couple of final messages for everyone before we stop the webinar. A link to the recording will be emailed to all registrants, so be looking for that. We invite you to email docs@uvahealth.org with further questions about the presentation and research. I think in the chat box, you'll also see Dr. Penberthy's email address and how you can get in touch with us. I know we didn't get to everyone's question tonight, but we are happy to talk to anyone who has some lingering questions or wants to find ways that they can participate and be part of this work. I encourage you to sign up for our bi-monthly e-newsletter. We can also support DOPS with a donation. Our work is fully funded. by generous individuals who make this work possible, and every bit of support helps DOPS continue to thrive. Those links are also in the chat. We thank you, Dr. Penberthy, for coming tonight and generously sharing your time. Thank you, everyone who asked questions, and we had such great participation, and we could talk for hours. So thank you, everyone. We're going to end the webinar and be looking for your recording. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Be well.